Toronto. My father was a businessman. I grew up in that side of things in Toronto, if you will. We lived in Toronto, but on the edge of Forest Hill, so we had quite a good mix of Jewish and Protestant kids, to put it that way. That was before the wave of immigration really hit. Italian greengrocers were definitely there as well, but it was old Toronto. I had no idea. I always thought I would be either an engineer or a businessman. So growing up in Toronto, I was damn sure I wasn't going to go to university in Toronto and live at home. So went to Queen's, had a great undergraduate experience at Queen's. And one of my professors was a Princeton graduate. He got me interested rather than going and working for Shell Oil or something like that. That seemed like a very sensible thing to do. And we were lucky at that point. This was 1965. There were lots of fellowships available. And I did the arithmetic, and I could go to Princeton, and the fellowships were enough to pay all the costs. So I was just as well off to do that as to go and work for $4,000 a year for Shell Oil. I was really interested in public policy. I was more interested in public policy than in the fine academic points of being an economist, but I was really interested in public policy. That was my professors at Queen's. That's what they were interested in. That was the time of the fight between the Conservative government and the governor of the Bank of Canada, which was a big issue. But I was very interested in the human side of it, not just the financial side. And so that was after the 61 census. And so I wrote a paper which used the 61 census data. This was in 64. And so I got very interested. I worked with Jenny Podluck was at the Dominion Bureau of Statistics at the time. So I worked for that. And then I came back after I finished my undergraduate degree. I came back and worked in what was started off as the old Department of Labor, which transitioned at that time to the Department of Employment and Immigration. In the end, budgets rule, and if you are interested in playing over a range of issues, then that is absolutely the place to be. But I was working very hard when I was back teaching at Queen's at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. I was working very hard on labor market issues, unemployment insurance, and so my first job was then in the social policy division, the brand new social policy division, which was created. I think Simon created that division basically to make sure there was an antidote to what was going on at the Department of Health and Welfare at the time, which I think both the Minister of Finance and his deputy were worried that it was going to spend us crazy. So just let me go through the steps, because yes, I started, as I say, working on the social side, but the big issue at the time was, just as it is today, was housing. And back then, you went where your deputy told you to go. Mr. Eastman said, I think you better go over to central mortgage and housing because there's a lot of action here, and we'd really like somebody to be there as their economist that understands that from a broader perspective and not just from the housing perspective. So I went there, and those were the days of AHOP and ARP and various new programs that we had to build housing that's cheap enough for folks. It's interesting that we're doing it quite differently today, but we're up against, in a sense, the government's up against the same issue. Back then, they had created the Ministry of Urban Affairs, and so it was being approached differently. But then at Thanksgiving in 1975, Mr. Trudeau said, "Zap, you're frozen." And Simon called me and said, "You better get back downtown. We've got a bigger problem on our hands." And so I was at the Anti-Inflation Board then for 2 years. And then I left government. I went back to teaching, went to the School of International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and actually did quite a bit of work for the Congressional Budget Office during those couple of years, because those were the years where inflation was going crazy. It was the time of whip inflation now and various crazy programs of the Nixon-Ford administration at the time. And then Mr. Carter became president. So I was there for 2.5 years, I guess. And then Mr. Trudeau returned to power, and Lloyd Axworthy was Minister of Employment, became Minister of Employment and Immigration. And Lloyd and I had been at Princeton together, although we didn't really know each other that well at Princeton, but we had both been there and knew the folks and had that sort of background. Princeton was at that time quite democratic in its outlook, whereas Hopkins was decidedly Republican, and they're quite different institutions. But at any rate, so it was quite clear they had to do something, and so they asked me to come and head up a task force on labor market development, which I did. Then I was about to go back to Hopkins, but at that point, Republicans had come back to power, and I discovered that most of our friends in Washington were Democrats and were gone, were leaving. And so in the end, I didn't go back, and I stayed, and then they asked me to be ADM and at that point. Well, so I had done a number of things. I had run the budget office at Finance. I then did the tax reform before the election. Mike Wilson was my minister. At that point, he was spending and very interested in what was going on at the IMF and the international institutions. And so he asked me if I would leave the tax side and go and work on that. I became the G7 deputy at that point in time, just before the wall came down. And so I spent 2 years working very closely with External Affairs and the Prime Minister's office as we in the West were trying to figure out how to cope with the sea change of the end, which spelt the end of the USSR. Even though Mike Wilson was Minister of Finance at that time, he still was the one who was designated to be the person who's going to play in this issue of how we actually coped with this sea change that had taken place in the USSR and in Eastern Europe. When Mike and I did a tour of the Baltics, obvious reason why we were doing that. And then in September, what would that have been, 91, to Moscow. We met with Mr. Gorbachev the very day he kicked the members of the last meeting of the Soviet, and I remember that instance very clearly, spending 2.5 hours with him as he was sitting, basically ruminating on what was going on. So that was a historic moment. And then the next day we went to the White House in Moscow and visited the new Prime Minister of Russia. And then we spent a lot of time at the G7 meetings with the Prime Minister, right? And so got to know the Prime Minister quite well in that context. And when Fred Gorbat, my predecessor, decided that he wanted to go and do things in the private sector, Mr. Mulroney simply called and said, would you take that on? Take on deputy minister, having known him in the context of dealing with the G7. When Mr. Mulroney came to office, the first issue, in a sense, the first economic issue, that occupied him was the deficit that had built up during the last years of the Trudeau government. And so we did 2 budgets trying to deal with that. But it was quite clear that if he was going to deal with that and use his political capital to deal with that he wouldn't be able to do some of the things that he really wanted to do, the structural changes in the economy. Because he was his background was business, right? And he had a sense that we could do things better, right? And so basically the middle of his first mandate, I would say, he said, well, we'll continue to try to deal with the deficit, but it's much more important that we deal with some of the other issues that I think we need to deal with. I mean, there were a lot of structural things that he really wanted to do, and one of them was to try get the top rates of income tax down. And so that was the shift. I moved from doing the budget with him to doing the tax reform. I mean, we argued that if he's going to get the income tax rates down, and that we all agreed that they were being very harmful to the entrepreneurship and investment that we needed to grow, that then we had to have a replacement source of revenue. So we spent quite a bit of time both working on the income tax side, which he was always on board with, but then saying, okay, how are we going to deal with the revenue side? Because the existing manufacturer sales tax was falling apart. And so we spent a lot of time with him, and he agreed that, yes, we've got to do it. It fitted with the objective of economic growth and so on. But then, prior to the election, he decided, and understandably said, I can't deal with the free trade and the tax at the same time, so I'm going to deal with the free trade, and I'll come back and we will institute the sales tax in my next mandate. And that's exactly what happened. The place to start was we had a government that came to power on the basis of a red book. a fairly clearly articulated set of plans that bore no reference to the fiscal realities of the time. Mr. Martin had been instrumental in writing the Red Book, and he arrives, has to somehow come to grips with this. And there we were, trying to explain the numbers that he faced, and that what he wanted to do in the Red Book was just not going to be possible. And that was the exercise until he tabled the budget the following February, which moved actually a long way if you look at the hard numbers, but not as far as certainly the financial sector, but I would say also the public felt that they needed to go. I would say it was very difficult because as a deputy minister, you were sitting there telling the incoming government that they couldn't do what they had just promised they were going to do. And that is a very difficult position, right? And so we took a lot of steps in the first budget, but it was not seen by the financial community to be enough, number one. And number two, Mexico was in deep trouble, right? And so by the spring, within 6 weeks of having done the budget, it was quite clear we have to go further, and that the public was ready for it. And I think that is the most important point, that the public was a long way ahead of where the incoming Liberal government was. Even the business guys in that government, and Mr. Chrétien understood fully that this had to be done not because they were black-hearted accountants, as the Mulroney ministers were painted as being, but because if government was going to be a force for good in society, they had to have the fiscal room to do it. I left it after we knew that we were going to have a balanced budget, and I had observed that the arguments that were being made on the health side to preserve the budget were not really very well thought through. So I went to UBC and worked with folks out there. I was in the business school, but I spent a lot of time working on the health structure issues with an amazing group of people that associated with the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. And we published the book, Why Are Some Nations Healthy and Others Not? That was the group that we worked with, which was a change in the mindset of what had to be done on the health side. So I had done that, and I was really interested in that. And it turned out that I thought I might actually go and work with a commercial bank, but that wasn't going to come through very quickly. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to stay forever as an academic in the business school. And so Mr. Chrétien called and said, why don't you come back? You've been working on this stuff. Why don't you come back and go to the Ministry of Health? In many ways, the health problems originate not at the federal level, they originate at the provincial level. And, you know, there are some things that we can do at the federal level. So we started to try get the change in health records keeping and health info way and so on, number one. And number two we really changed the emphasis in the department to look at the population health issues, which is what I was interested in, much in the same way dealing with the issues that I had dealt with much earlier at the Department of Employment and Immigration. In order for economic growth to actually benefit society, then you had to find ways to deliver programs that were socially helpful but supported economic growth at the same time. Let me start from a slightly different angle. If you're going to have a successful organization, whether that be in business or government or indeed in academia, you have to have a leader that encourages internal discussion and debate. If you will, the decision table in the organization has to be one in which those at the table bring to bear their expertise and so on in the best possible way. And the leader has to be able to accept or listen to what they're saying, number one. Secondly, also have a degree of, I don't know what the right word is, humility, to not put themselves front and center and hence choke off the discussion that takes place. What I think of as being a strong leader is that you are sufficiently open, you listen well enough, you don't always put yourself in the play quite too early, if you will. The leader is going to have to make a decision at the end, but you want the decision to be made that two things, that you avoid mistakes, but secondly, that you bring your troops along with you, right? And I would say that's no different in the public sector than it is in the private sector. Mr. Mulroney came in with quite a different approach, and he came in with a bunch of ministers, some of whom had a bit of government experience, but many of whom did not, and some of whom were from the very populist wing of that party. And so he was always trying to hold the party together throughout. So it was very, very different. But I was at the Department of Finance at the time. So my experience that I'm speaking here from is one of the Department of Finance, because we got a government that came in that was bound and determined to do the sorts of things that we had been advocating or working very hard on to try to convince the last Trudeau government that had to be done. We were so ready, in a sense, for that change. So that was a transition for us at Finance, which was very easy. It was a transition for many ministries that was awful, because they had new ministers that didn't really understand what was going on. The transition to Mr. Chrétien it looked more difficult because the Red Book stood in such contrast to where the Mulroney government, where the image of the Mulroney government was. I would say more the image of the Mulroney government than the actuality, but that contrast was very, very sharp. But Mr. Chrétien was an experienced person. He had people that were experienced. Mr. Chrétien basically understood that if he could do what he wanted to do, he couldn't do it from the position that he started with. And so he had to move. And so the first mandate was a mandate of opening the door to the second and third mandate, doing what had to be done so that that door was open. And so the transition, again, from my perspective, was not really very difficult once it was understood what had to be done. So there wasn't great difficulty. You are Dr. No, right? You also have one of the most important tools in your toolkit, namely the tax system. And as we have discovered, we can spend just as easily through the tax system as we can through the expenditure side of the budget. You have to approach each issue from a analytical standpoint as to what the impact would have financially on the government and would have on the likely impact on economic growth and hence future revenues of the government. In this part your Dr. No around the deputy table, you are also there kind of encouraging folks to work on stuff to bring it forward in a way that will fit not just in the fiscal framework, but will fit in terms of generating economic growth going forward. It doesn't matter whether you decide on a business career or a public service career or an academic career. In all of those areas, you're always striving to make a mark that will leave the country, your institution, your company stronger and make the world better in some sense, right? So I think that I was very lucky, and I think my counterparts today are not so lucky. I was lucky in the regard, first of all, it was before the era of social media. Right? And so, you had time. It was before the era of the 24-hour news cycle. So you had time to think about things. And that is important. And your minister or the prime minister could quite easily say, look, that's an interesting question. I'll get back to you on that. Much more difficult today. Much, much more difficult, which means that the pressure is on all the time to respond rather than to think about what it is you're doing. So I think the job today is just much, much tougher. I think the second thing I would say is that the relationship between the minister and the deputy, or between the minister and the public servant, then was very direct. They were very small, right? There was 2 people in the minister's office, right? So it was a different working relationship. And I guess the last thing I would say is things were much more personal. In part because when I joined, everything was so much smaller. And so you had personal relationships with the key ministers. You had very personal relationships with your deputy colleagues. I just think, given social media, given the expansion of the size of government, I would say, given that the current prime minister has tried to do so much, that when you try to do more than you actually have the capacity in an operational sense to deal with, you then really do run into trouble. And so I guess I just think it is more difficult for folks today, certainly than I had it. Maybe I was overly lucky, but more difficult than I had it.